Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jim Hall, and I lead the Infrastructure Transitions Research Consortium. I see we've got more than 40 people with us this afternoon for this, the second webinar in the ITRC webinar series. Let me just provide you an overview of where we've got to. This series is really a series of snapshots to provide insights into both what the Infrastructure Transitions Research Consortium has done over the last 10 years in terms of developing national infrastructure system simulation modeling capability. And it includes some deeper dives into a whole series of different aspects of the ITRC's work. And the deep dive today is looking at the analysis we've been doing on the Oxford-Cambridge Arc. You'll see actually in the top left-hand side of this screen the word Mistral. That's the second program of the ITRC, which was supported by the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council. And Mistral stands for multi-scale. So as we went into the second phase of the ITRC's research, which the first phase had developed this unique new national system of systems model, NISMOD, going into the next phase, we saw the need to extend from the national scale to go both upscale to understand the interconnection between the UK's infrastructure and the rest of the world. And we'll talk about that in some of the subsequent webinars, but also to go downscale, recognizing that a lot of infrastructure is local, and actually a lot of the innovation going on in infrastructure in relation to heat networks or autonomous vehicles relates to very local scale provision of infrastructure. And so we've taken NISMOD and made it much more detailed in order to represent these local scale dynamics. And then we tried to find a suitable place to apply it to. And while we were doing that research, the Oxford-Cambridge Arc was going up the agenda very rapidly. The National Infrastructure Commission did a study on the ARC, and since then there's been a great deal of action, quite a lot of talk, probably more so than action, but also a significant commitment to East-West Rail, for example, to make this thing, which is the Oxford-Cambridge Arc, actually happen. And the analysis we've been doing has been seeking to inform that. I mean, there's a good question, a legitimate question as to what the ARC is, and some of our subsequent speakers might comment on that. But I see it as being a recognition of the enormous innovation potential, the unpent potential for very productive, high added value jobs, the potential to attract inward investment, including from around the world, recognizing the brand associated with Oxford and Cambridge, but also an exercise in place creation of taking this somewhat disconnected corridor across the country, and through a combination of strategic infrastructure investments, but also housing development and urbanization, creating a very different type of place, which is livable, has space for nature within it, and is sustainable. And that's a complex business. And the argument that we are making within ITRC is that you need analysis in order to inform this very complex set of decisions. So a lot of trade-offs are involved. It's very multi-dimensional, but modeling enables us to look at a whole range of possible future possibilities explore what the implications are for people, for the economy, for sustainability. The first phase of our analysis we did last year, and we wrote it up in this report, which you can find on the ITRC website. And we launched this analysis at the Institution of Civil Engineers last year. We had a follow-up event in bang in the middle of the arc at Cranfield University. You can take a look at this work for yourselves. We're not going to repeat it at this webinar. What we're going to do now actually is talk about a number of things which have happened since we launched that work. The work we've done previously attracted a great deal of attention. We were invited by England's Economic Heartland, the regional transport body, to look at decarbonisation pathways for the transport network, and Simon Blaney is going to talk about that. And we've benefited from some funding from the Alan Turing Institute to do more very detailed spatial optimization, which can inform the spatial strategy. So to look at the trade-offs between building and nature, identify where the most accessible places might be, where are the most appropriate places for development, and what might the nature of that development be. And in that sense, I think the way in which we're approaching the ARC is part of the unique characteristic of the ARC, in the sense that as well as taking this very interesting place forwards, we're creating simulations and modeling and a capacity to inform decision making, which in many senses is unique and will, I think, become part of what the ARC is as it goes forwards in the future. So you're going to hear about that first from Dr. Alistair Ford from Newcastle University, and then from Simon Blaney, who will talk about the work with England's Economic Heartland. And then we will have feedback from two extremely important partners in this work, Bev Hindle, who's director of the ARC Leaders Group, and Alan Penn, who is Chief Scientific Advisor at the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. As we go through that, please use the Twitter handle and post on LinkedIn if you'd like to do so. And once we've had these 4 contributions, we'll go into some discussion, and please start posting your questions up in the chat as we go along, and I'll chair that discussion. We have until sometime after the hour to end our discussion. I'll take a bit of judgment on that. Maybe we'll try to end by 4 o'clock, but if the discussion is particularly active, we could go on for about 10 minutes more, but we'll certainly be done by 15:15. So that's the plan for this afternoon. Let me just skip to this list here and remind you of where we're going next, and to register for as many of the subsequent webinars as you're interested in. And with that, I'll hand over to Ali Ford.
I apologize. I've come into my office today for better Wi-Fi, and some workmen have decided to start drilling outside. So if you start hearing noise, I apologize for that. It's just typical. So what I want to do today is give a quick overview of some of the work, as Jim says, we've been doing with some funding from the Alan Turing Institute, looking at development alternatives for the Oxford-Cambridge ARC. And this is looking at the spatial patterns that we might see under potential future planning scenarios. So the idea for this piece of work, as Jim said, came from some of the work in ITR Mistral, thinking about the Oxford-Cambridge ARC as a region and how it may develop in the future. So we've seen reports like this carried out by Fifth Studio, which looked at potential development options across the Arc region and included images like this, one where we might see new settlements springing up across the Arc linked to the new transport infrastructure that may be constructed from east to west, and others where we might see urban expansion around existing settlements within the Arc region. Now, these pictures give a nice indication of the potential directions of travel, but what we wanted to do is think in more detail spatially about how these might actually play out in reality across the Arc. And we know that planners in a region as large as this, or anywhere in the UK, are under a set of competing pressures with competing objectives of what they're trying to achieve. So clearly there's a big demand for more land for housing, not just in the Arc, but particularly in the Arc, with very ambitious housing totals projected across that region. There are pressures from environmental issues such as flooding, and particularly with increased extreme rainfall and things like that may come around with climate change. Planners need to think about protecting future development from natural hazards. Things like focusing on active travel and sustainable transport as an alternative to locking in car dependency in some of these new housing developments that we might see. And alongside that, linking to new rail stations, so thinking about what in the US is called transit-oriented development, so building densely around public transport hubs. There's also an issue with protecting and enhancing natural capital and green space across a region like the Arc, and also providing land for employment and other uses alongside residential land use. Now, some of these different planning objectives have trade-offs between them. So if we want to make more land available for housing, do we need to sacrifice or build in the floodplain? There's a question to be asked about that. There are tensions between providing additional land for housing and protecting some of the natural capital across the Arc. And then there are potential co-benefits. So providing green corridors might also allow us to provide active travel corridors, for example. So what we wanted to do is try and explore some of these planning objectives and make transparent these potential trade-offs and tensions using modelling and analysis, as Jim said in his introduction. So we have a model at Newcastle that we've been developing through ITRC and with this Alan Turing funding that was mentioned, called the Urban Development Model. And this aims to make spatially explicit representations of land use by using a cellular automata model that produces a detailed grid of potential urban development driven by future scenarios. And I'll go into a little bit more detail of how this works on the next couple of slides. What we want to do is, that was on auto advance. Using a set of attractors and constraints that reflect planning policy, we want to then simulate the land development based on a suitability score. And this suitability score is shaped by what we try and interpret the planning policy to be. And the final output is a set of spatial maps that can then be compared to other spatial representations that might start to allow us to analyze and get numbers and quantitative information about some of these trade-offs that we mentioned on the previous slide. So attractors might be things like how close land is to existing development if we want to look for urban expansion. They might be things like how close land is to railway stations or public transport hubs across the Arc region, or it might be the proximity to the road network if we want to build next to existing road infrastructure. So all of these attractors are spatial representations of drivers that may target development in a particular area across the Arc region in this case. Alongside attractors, we have a set of constraints. So looking at Oxford here in detail, constraints can be things like water bodies. So we can't build on areas where there are water bodies. They may be things like flood zones. So this is the environment A, as you can see, flood zone 3. Open space, so this is green space or parks and gardens, etc. Current development, whether we want to allow retrofit or rebuilding of existing development is a question. And these constraints stack up, as you see here, until the only areas that are left under consideration, and if we introduce additional constraints like, for example, SSSIs or nature reserve areas, we end up with very little land available in somewhere like Oxford that isn't constrained from development. And the question is, which of these constraints might we want to relax in order to free up land for housing? Or do we free up none of these constraints and move that housing elsewhere outside of the Oxford City area in this example? One of the things we're considering in this work are nature recovery networks. So Alison Smith, who works with Jim at Oxford, has been working with a number of stakeholders across the Arc, initially in the Oxfordshire region, but now across the Arc in general, to build a representation of a nature recovery network for the Arc, to think about how we might increase and enhance provision for nature across this region. So we have a core network, which is in the dark purple on this map on the left, and then a recovery zone in the light purple that would free up additional space for nature. And we can think about what that means in terms of the amount of land available for housing and where housing might have to go as an alternative. So there are different dimensions we can start to simulate here. We can think about, as it was shown in the first fifth studio caricature almost, new settlements versus urban expansion. Do we build around existing urban areas, or do we build new settlements in standalone points across the Arc? And then there's this tension or trade-off as well between green, what we're calling green development, which is aiming for sustainable development, dense development around public transport hubs, protection of the natural capital and the nature recovery networks in the Arc, versus grey development, which is more a business as usual type of development that we've seen in recent years, car dependent development, build at a lower density around the edge of settlements. So we've tried to build scenarios that represent these different future trajectories. The suitability drivers that I mentioned earlier, here's an example for an urban expansion scenario. The dark areas are excluded from development, so these are areas like flood zone 3 over in this section in the east of the Arc, or SSSIs or natural capital areas around the Arc. And then the lighter, the darker the green, sorry, the more attractive to development these areas across the Arc are. The other alternative is the green scenario, where we have now this nature recovery network taking out much more of the land across the Arc, and therefore focusing the amount of development in much smaller spatial zones than is available in the green scenario. So these drivers are what target development in certain areas. And these allow us to produce simulations like these, which are in yellow, the new development that we might see. And we have the new settlement scenarios at the top and the expansion scenarios at the bottom. And we have the grey scenarios on the left and the green scenarios on the right. So trying to simulate different options across these spectrums. Now, clearly, in reality, there will be other options in between that aren't at the extremes of these scenario spaces as we've simulated them here. There may be a combination of both new settlements and expansion across the Arc, or there may be a position between grey and green, but these are to simulate almost the endpoints of potential options. So we can start to map future development patterns like these across the Arc region based on scenario decisions. And this development is then also broken down by dwelling density. So we've got a map here of Milton Keynes, where we're showing potential development at different densities around different density drivers. So we want higher density near to public transport hubs, for example, and this can play out across the Arc at this 1 hectare scale that we're looking at here, with the yellow pixels that we're seeing. And what this allows us then to do is start to compare these scenarios and pull out metrics that allow us to assess the impacts of such development. Objectively, we can just pull out spatial measurements of things like how much land is developed under each of these scenarios. And as you'd expect, if you build more dense development, you take up less land across the Arc. So these kinds of metrics here. Or we can start to look at the amount of development, the number of dwellings that are built for a particular accessibility pattern. So this shows in blue the number of dwellings being built at a given measure of accessibility between 0 and 1, lowest and highest across the Arc. So we can see under the green scenario, we can move more development towards the higher accessibility by rail, for example, thus trying to encourage a shift to sustainable transport. So hopefully that quick run through has given you a summary of the kind of analysis and the kind of metrics we're trying to pull out from this work that we've been doing across the Arc, but I'd be happy to take any questions at the appropriate point. Thanks for listening to that bit.
That's great. Thanks very much indeed, Ali. That really explains how this analysis that we're doing is enabling us to explore at a really fine level of detail a whole range of possible futures for the Arc, and also extract metrics for how those perform with respect to sustainability and a whole series of goals within the ARC. I'm now going to hand over to Simon Blaney from Southampton University, who's going to talk about the analysis of decarbonisation pathways for transport in the region. One of the questions we've got on the chat is business as usual still a valid scenario in the light of our carbon urgencies? And Simon will endeavour to address that question, at least with respect to transport emissions, which we know to be some of the tricky emissions to reduce on our pathway to net zero. A reminder then to put your questions in the chat, keep them coming, and we can discuss them after the presentations. Over to you, Simon.
Okay, thank you very much, Jim. I'm hoping you can all see my screen, but do yell if you can't. My name's Simon Blaney. I'm an associate professor in transportation at the University of Southampton's Transportation Research Group, and I'm going to tell you quickly about some work that's been done by Adrian Hickford, Tom Russell and myself, looking at pathways to decarbonise transport in England's economic heartland. So there is an ambition in the England's economic heartland transport strategy for them to get to a situation where transport in the EEH region is net zero carbon by 2050. Now, clearly, this is a very challenging target for EEH or indeed for any region, and there are a number of barriers which exist to achieving that. But what we were trying to do in the work we did was to assess the impacts for road traffic in particular of three possible pathways which we identified to reach this net zero carbon goal. And I will quickly run you through those now. So Jim mentioned earlier the work we had done previously on the Oxford-Cambridge Arc, which included a transport element. There are some similarities with what we did in this later project, but also some differences. So here we're only focusing on a single growth scenario for the region with no additional transport infrastructure. So we're assuming that, for example, the expressway isn't built. And we're assuming that we have got a single goal which we need to reach, which is this aim of getting transport to a situation where it is net zero carbon. So what we have done is focused only on transport. We haven't looked at any other infrastructure sector in detail, and looked at these different strategic options to give EEH as an authority a better understanding of some of the impacts of the different approaches they could take to reaching their desired end goal. Now, as you'd expect, there are a number of assumptions which underlie this analysis around things like population and economic growth. As I said, we have held these constant across our different scenarios to minimize any confusion when we're interpreting the results. But just to give an example of the kind of assumptions that do underlie the analysis. So for population, we have made use of a single scenario through to 2050, which is based on current housing development plans within the region. And this sees around 1 million more people living in the region by 2050, with quite a varied pattern of growth across different areas in the region, which differs from the standard ONS projections, but is in line with EEH's own expectations of what's most likely to occur. So there are similar underlying assumptions around things like economic growth, but the way the model is set up, it is very flexible, and you can plug in kind of any scenarios you want to around how population and the economy might change in the future, and it will take account of that at a reasonably spatially detailed level. So what we then did was to come up with a set of possible pathways which would allow us to reach this zero carbon goal. I said at the start there were 3 pathways. Actually, there are kind of 3.5 plus a business as usual pathway, because we thought it would be sensible to have a baseline to compare against. So all of our pathways except the business as usual do assume that there will be 100% zero emission road vehicles in 2050, because it is obviously impossible to get to a net zero carbon situation if you have road vehicles which are not zero emission. our business as usual is the exception, but this was kind of based on extrapolating recent trends in transport demand into the future, so that you do get a significant growth in zero emission vehicles by 2050, but still a very significant proportion of vehicles on the roads which are powered using conventional fuels. So just to run quickly over the differences between our different zero carbon pathways, the first of these, the highly connected pathway, would see substantial growth in the use of technologies to enhance the operation of the transport network. So for example, we've assumed that there would be 30% of vehicles by 2050 which were entirely autonomous, with then implications for increased efficiency of vehicle operation and better use made of road capacity. The second scenario or pathway, the adapted fleet pathway, sees electrification of the vehicle fleet occurring at a faster rate than in the other pathways, but also some quite substantial take up of hydrogen vehicles, so that by 2050 you would have 25% of vehicles powered by hydrogen. And then the final pathway, which we sort of split into two options, is based around changes in behavior, reducing the level of road traffic, so reducing the number of car trips in particular that are made. The first of these sort of sub pathways is a policy-led pathway, which would be particularly driven by quite a strict use of road charging to make car travel less attractive. Whereas the second option, the results-led pathway, assumes that there will be societal change which reduces the number of trips that people make by car without the need for necessarily policies such as pricing to force this to happen. So we ran these pathways through the NISMOD transport model, and this gave us a number of results. Due to time, I can only quickly pick up on a couple of highlights. Clearly, with all of the pathways apart from business as usual, you do get a drop in carbon emissions for all of the pathways, but this happens more rapidly with the adapted fleet because you have got faster take-up of the vehicles as you'd expect. Actually, though, adaptive fleet, by the time you get to 2050, has lower electricity use than most of the other scenarios because of the use of hydrogen-powered vehicles, and this could then have potentially quite significant implications for the electricity supply network within the area, depending on how this hydrogen was actually produced. Maybe more interesting, though, is to look at what these results mean for congestion and traffic speeds, because in all of our pathways, we have got a situation where more trips are being made by car than was the case in our baseline year. And the reason for this is that huge level of population growth. Even if you assume that individual people are making less car trips, because population has grown so substantially, you have got more car trips overall, and therefore you have got quite a drop in travel speeds and therefore a growth in congestion under all of our pathways in the peak hours. Although there is quite a clear difference between the behavioural shift pathway and the other pathways, because you have got a situation with the behavioural shift policy-led pathway where the road pricing regime has significantly attenuated that growth in congestion, which could potentially be quite important, bearing in mind that England's economic heartland obviously have other policy goals which go beyond decarbonisation. But I think, rapidly running out of time. So just to sum up with where this work led. So EEH have decided to adopt an approach which actually combines two of our pathways for their transport strategy. So these are the highly connected and policy-led behaviour shift pathways. As they say, this will require potentially a wholesale change to the way in which connectivity is viewed and planned within the ARC, and it is going to need a combination of a number of different policies in order to actually achieve these desired outcomes. So this is partly around things which can be done locally, so infrastructure and services which enable a shift to low carbon travel, but there will also be a need for national and regional demand management policies, plus some fairly wide-scale behavioural change. So I had better stop there, as I think I am over time, but again, like Ali, I'm happy to take questions in due course at the appropriate time, so thank you.
Thanks very much indeed for that, Simon. Before we hand over to two sets of comments from Bev and then from Alan, let me just point out a couple of things which both Simon and Ali referred to. The first is this creature Daphne, the Data and Analytics Facility for National Infrastructure, which is where all of this modeling capability that we're talking about now resides at the Rutherford Appleton Laboratory in Harwell, which is the national hub for data modeling and simulation of infrastructure systems, and is being increasingly widely used by the academic community and by end users. And that's where this work is going to reside. So, for example, the England's economic heartland modelling can be used by stakeholders like EEH and their partners to do different scenarios and different runs. I'd also point out that clearly we've had two focal perspectives there. Simon didn't or referred in passing to the connection with the energy system. In our previous analysis, we did develop decarbonisation pathways for the energy system, for water, which we've had a question about, and looked at the digital connectivity which would be required for connected and autonomous vehicles. So we have been able to look at some of the other infrastructure sectors that questions are coming up about. Keep those questions coming. But in the meantime, I will hand over to Bev Hindle to make some remarks from the perspective of stakeholders in the ARC.
Great, thanks very much, Jim. And good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bev Hindle. So I've got two hats really, and both hats are quite interested in this conversation. One is the director of the ARC Leadership Group, a role I'll be taking on full-time as of November. But in the meantime, I'm also director of the Oxfordshire Growth Board, and we're quite knee-deep into scenario building for our Oxfordshire plan to 2050. And so, of course, this is directly relevant to both those roles. Jim, in his introduction, suggested that I say a little bit about the ARC, and I'll just to give you a little bit more context, and apologies if some of you are already aware of this, but the work that's been happening to develop the ARC, it's been identified as an area and an economic priority region for the government. And as such, we've been waiting for a little while now in terms of the detailed sort of rollout, what government means by that, following positive response to the National Infrastructure Commission work from a few years back. But in the meantime, the group I represent, which is, well, roughly 40 different partners of local authorities, universities, and LEPS business boards across the ARC, are working in a collaborative way to try and help shape that future vision of what that region might be and what the delivery profile of that region might be. And so to that end, and I have passed it along to Tim, it's a bit of a weighty tome, but we've just put in and submitted to government as part of their comprehensive spending review an ARC economic prospectus. And I'd encourage you to take a look at that, because I think it's the first time we've collectively sat down and wrote some things down that we felt were important around our ambition and around our offer. And really, Jim summarized those. I won't go over that again, but really that emphasis on innovation, that leads to research and development investment for a country that, quite frankly, I think is going to need return on its investment as part of its economic drive for the future. And this region should be able to help lead that. But what I think is far more interesting and far more fascinating, I think Jim and the work that ITRC have done, and I think what you've heard today, exemplifies this multi-layered benefit we get out of investment here. So the work that this has been aimed at delivering creates its own products, it creates its own energy, which is excellent in its own self, but it also can be used and should be used to help generate our own thinking. So many of you might know that the ARC, the government intends to roll out something called the ARC Spatial Framework over the next few years. It intends to roll that out hopefully in the autumn. I think I won't go past my place. I know that there's an intention and there are people working on it. Its exact timetable, its exact delivery model, not yet seen, and we're anticipating that. But the work that's being done here, quite frankly, is ahead of the game on that and is starting to build that scenario testing into the thinking of what we might start to look at across the arc. So not only do you have this benefit of this anyways, you can start to actually directly apply it and use it for our own benefit in terms of regional scale planning and scenario testing for the future, which is really, really important. And if I know I don't have it in front of me, but if you look at the ambitions that we're proposing and pushing in our prospectus, you start to see this idea of a sustainable future, of an inclusive future, an economically successful future, but one that is based on evidence and one that is based on being using that intelligence to our own advantage is something that I think this fits with very, very well. I think the other thing I comment on, and I think it's really, really important, that the work that EEH and is echoed again by the ARC leadership group, this idea of decarbonizing transport. I think there was a wider ambition to make sure that we are doing everything we can to lead that space nationally, if not internationally, to be able to take people into that delivery stage. So we've been talking about this for some time. We've been setting goals for ourselves, but where are we actually delivering that difference? And I think this evidence really is important to be able to start to drive what will the consequences look like? What is it? What are those choices going to be? And what, these are the assumptions used in modeling. Are we going to go beyond those assumptions? Are we going to stick with those assumptions? So I think it's really, really important as a showcase for us to be able to start to see the impacts our different policy decisions might take us on. The last thing, Jim, I was going to add was we have some pretty lofty expectations of us. We currently, as an ARC, generate about a little over 100 billion GVA. The expectation is that we're going to double that by 2050. So the real challenge is, can you do that, but in a way that is sustainable? Can you do that in a way that is inclusive? And can you do that in a way that starts to challenge and tackle some of the world, this nation or this region, this nation, the world's biggest challenges? I think that's the site of ambition we're talking about here in the ARC. And this kind of modeling and this testing is in my view completely linked to our ability to evidence that and to draw out not just investment, because of course whenever you put a prospectus in, you're hoping you're going to draw an investment, but it's as much about support, it's much about commitment from the government to be able to drive these types of changes going forward. So again, I really applaud the work that's being done here, and I'm really pleased to see it mature. And Jim and I have been talking about this for a long time. It's really nice to see it getting to a point where it's actually a tool that we should be able to deploy. And if I put my Oxfordshire hat on for a moment, obviously pleased that the work is taking place in Oxfordshire. That's always a great thing. But what's really fascinating is, and just a bit of anecdotal bit, Jim and I haven't talked about this, we're really struggling as a group of officers to articulate at a strategic level, in the absence of a lot of strategic direction and policy anymore in national planning policy, because it doesn't really exist. And the white paper was pretty silent on it as well. That there's going to be even more requirement for us to be able to evidence our thinking and show what, if we're talking about wanting to change the world by 2050, but we're in an evidence-based planning system that has no precedent or has no evidence trail, then we're going to need models that are very convincing to be able to convince an inspector or a public or a development industry of what our decisions are based on. If they are not based on what we've done before, because we no longer can do that, we need to have really robust models looking forward that can help us evidence why we feel there's a shift or a change required. That is not that easily sinking into a lot of people's minds. And I think having tools like this where you can visibly and visually see and interact with it, run those different scenarios, test those different things. I was very impressed by the work that Alistair was presenting earlier. For us at a local level, sub-regional level, that's going to be really important, especially when you've got a statutory plan that has to go through quite a rigorous examination process. Jim, I'll leave it there. And thank you for the opportunity, and really pleased with what was presented. Thank you.
Thank you, Bevan. Thanks for those remarks and for all of your support over the last months and years, and also for highlighting something which has come up in the chat a bit already, which is the potential transferability of this work and capability which we've developed in the ARC and for the ARC, but in many ways could be transferred to other situations around the country. And with that, I'll hand over to Alan Penn, Chief Scientific Advisor from the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. And a very distinguished professor of spatial analysis from University College London.
Thanks very much. So Jim, it's been really good to see these presentations. It's absolutely fascinating to see the work that the ITRC has been developing. Now, some reflections. At the bottom of all modelling, the real question that comes to my mind is around the question of validation. And the question is, how certain can you be that the nature of the model is effective, if you like, in explaining the kinds of emergence that will take place in social and economic systems? Now, clearly, you hedge your bets by scenarios. So under the scenario sort of way of working, you make some assumptions and you decide, well, let's assume that it goes off on this track, or alternatively, it goes off on that track. But ultimately, the thing that I think is really required here is some proper kind of, I guess, sensitivity analysis about the assumptions that underlie these models. And the reason I'm saying this is that at the moment, we're going through a complete, potential crisis in terms of how it is that people live their lives. Will they live in cities? Or will they want to move to more rural areas? Will they want to work from home, or will they want to go to the office? How is it that that will reflect in the nature of spatialization of the way we actually build in the future? And of course, nobody has an answer to any of those questions. This is an impossible challenge to be able to answer that. But what we need out of modeling is an ability to question without building the implications of having done one or another. And what we need as planners who are going to try to get the best out of this for all concerned is an ability to say, well, the reason that we've done it in this way is to achieve these ends. And at least we have a better than evens chance of achieving that, because that's what the model suggests it will do, and our confidence in that model is at this sort of level. So there's a challenge there, and I understand it's a very difficult challenge, because ultimately it comes down to social and behavioral modeling rather than economic or traffic modeling. And I think there is the real opportunity for the future, is to be able to build models in which we can actually give voice to, if you like, the social and economic drivers that may influence the way that individuals behave and the way they choose, and institutions, organizations behave, and the way they choose to inhabit the space that we create. So that's the first observation. My second observation is really around the nature of the arc itself. And the arc it's a conceptual entity. At the moment, it's not a real entity. It's a set of adjacent sort of areas of the country, and without the infrastructure that will run through them, the railway, the roadway, expressway, and so forth, it's actually not necessarily got a logic to it. It has a wonderful intellectual logic, the idea of Oxford and Cambridge linking together at Milton Keynes and being a great intellectual heartland for the country is a fantastic idea. But the reality of it is that all the current transport infrastructure goes in the wrong direction for it. And so there's a real question there in my mind. Is this something that becomes a reality? We build 1 million homes. Will these 1 million homes be directed towards economic innovation, new business, and new development in Oxford, Cambridge, Milton Keynes? Or will they become dormitories for a rather close London just to the south of them? Making use of existing transport radials rather than the arc radial, or the arc circumferential, if you like, that would join that set of 3 regions. there's an open question. And it's one which I think it'd be really interesting to hear reflections on, because I suspect that the market for the homes and the market for the businesses may spot those opportunities and make use of them, regardless of what we as intellectuals come in and say we would like people to do. And it's really around that set of questions that I think it would be good to have a discussion. I'll leave it at that, I think.
Okay, thanks very much indeed, Alan. And those are two very good challenges for us to get our teeth into. We've got a series of questions already on the chat, and we've got two very good questions from Alan there. But please continue to fire your questions into the chat. I think to start with, I'll pass back to Ali and then Simon to respond on these questions, well, as many of you as you like, around validation, the geography of the arc itself, vis-a-vis the mega tractor in London, and then also a few questions in the chat. One for Ali, I think, from Stuart Turner, around accessibility. I'll respond to Sue James in a moment about water. One for Simon, I think, from Brian Love, about modal shift. And I think Ali's already responded to the question around property values from Nicholas Falk, but you may wish to say some more about that. But let me pass over to Ali to pick up on as many of those as you like. And perhaps after that, Bev might like to respond to Alan's second question as well, in terms of the nature and the geography of the arc, whether it is a place geographically. But over to Ali.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks, Alan and Bev, for those responses and provocations, as it were. I agree entirely with Alan's points about validation and about why we use scenarios as a way of almost getting out of that difficult spot. But what we want to try and do with the model we've built here, we've deliberately built a very simple model that tries to capture almost a caricature of planning policy. We try and boil it down to the basic facets that drive why certain land is developed and other land isn't. And some of this is based on empirical work. So somebody with one of Jim's RAs at Oxford has been looking at densities across the arc and what's there historically and where those high density developments, low density developments have happened, etc. So we can use that historical trend to drive forward into the future, with the caveat that obviously, the past is no guide to the future when we're going through big changes, systemic changes as we are at the moment. But what we also want to do with a new piece of funding that started actually on the 1st of October from the Alan Turing Institute is to start simulating far more potential futures. So we've been building this urban development model onto Daphne, so it's enabled to be run on the cloud, and we can run hundreds, if not thousands, of potential futures. And then what we want to do is look through those potential futures to start pulling out the most promising alternatives and looking at what's driven those alternatives in our model. So we can start to kind of hone down on what might be the important factors that we need to concentrate on. So we want to expand massively the number of simulations we're able to do and the number of these scenarios that we're able to test, and then pick through those result sets to look for the most promising outcomes. Now, one of the things we've also done to simplify things up to now is think about the arc as a self-contained region, but we're very aware of this huge black hole just off to the southeast of London, kind of gravitationally sucking a lot of activity in that direction. And as Bev's pointed out in the chat, is there a question that London is now ceasing to have as much of an attraction, and because of the the response to COVID and other pressures, that's something we can explore. But again, to go back to the scenario point, what we want to enable through this modelling is a conversation. We want to be able to use these models as ways of saying, well, what if we were to make this assumption? What would it do to the spatial pattern? And then very quickly generate alternatives that then can be used by planners or decision makers to think about these alternatives as they're developing their much more detailed plans. So we're never going to capture all of the factors in our models that drive spatial development, but we want to be able to expose these questions and expose these tensions that might be playing out as spatial development happens across somewhere like the Arc. Just quickly to the more specific questions, Jim, if you want me to answer those now. On Stuart's point about accessibility and different transport patterns, we capture accessibility using a transport cost model, which for a set of spatial zones, so we're using MSOA zones, we can capture the accessibility of that zone to employment by road or public transport using this very simple model. That then gives us an attractiveness of each zone in terms of its accessibility under different transport scenarios. So we can include the east-west rail line in those scenarios, or we can exclude it. And we can see how it changes accessibility to jobs. And that then gives each area a different kind of attractiveness that we can then use to drive development to the more accessible areas as opposed to the less accessible areas. Now, there's a good point there, Stuart, about a lot of the areas that may see growth under an urban expansion scenario that currently don't have the kind of urban transport systems that we might need in the future. But again, by using scenarios, we could simulate a scenario where the accessibility to those areas by public transport or active travel or whichever mode we're interested in could be improved, and see how that changes the development patterns across the Arc. And then crucially, the reason we're doing this is then to measure the impacts of those changes in terms of land take, density of development, trade-offs against other metrics that we might want to be measuring. So that's how we see these models working and being used. And hopefully that gives a flavour for what we're trying to do, but happy to take further questions.
Great, thanks, Ali. Keep the questions coming, and there's a good discussion going on in the chat. But Simon, have you got any thoughts on those points which have come up previously?
Yeah, I'll try and be brief, not least because I've got to go at 4 for a teaching commitment, so I want to give a chance for questions. But I think on the behavioural point, I mean, I don't think when we developed a strategic transport model, we were intending to be able to model behaviour explicitly. And I wonder if actually it's ever sensible to try and capture the nuances of human behaviour within a strategic model itself, or whether what you're actually better in doing is thinking about how that behaviour might materialise in terms of travel patterns, and then capture that in the transport modelling through changes in trip rates and trip timings and things like that. And I think what we were trying to do in our scenarios was to start thinking about how that behavioural change might occur in the future, and then how that would translate into sort of transport metrics. Now, the COVID situation particularly is an interesting one, because it's obviously still developing, but the changes in travel behaviour that are occurring are not necessarily entirely desirable ones. In the trips that aren't being made tend to be trips which are actually quite well suited to public transport, and those are the ones which are perhaps being lost as there's more white collar work happening from home. And the trips which are still being made are the ones which are harder for public transport to actually adequately deal with. So I'm hesitant to sort of draw any too firm conclusions, because clearly it's not obvious how things are going to pan out in the future. But if we have a situation where public transport continues to be perceived as being unattractive or unsafe for a period of sort of months or years, then while there may be a shift in behaviour which means that overall travel has gone down, the environmental and sort of congestion relief benefits may not be as great as we might necessarily assume. And again, I guess you would then need to look at various scenarios as to how that might play out and run that through the model to see what that would mean for longer term planning. And that's perhaps something we should think about doing. what else was raised? I'm trying to remember. Just to clarify, I mean, I know there's been sort of discussions around sort of treating the EEH area or the ARC area in isolation. So we haven't done that in the model. We have run the model as a national model, even though we've only focused in the results on a specific region. So the broader connectivity should still be captured in there. But I'll probably stop there just to give the chance for people to ask any further specific questions they might want to.
That's great. Thanks, Simon. Let me just respond very briefly to the question from Sue James about water. And that's not a resource we talked about at this webinar, but it was part of our previous analysis. And like Simon's transport model, the analysis we've done for the ARC is embedded within a national water resource system model that is now actually being used by Ofwat and the Environment Agency for their national water resource framework. And that's particularly important in the ARC because the water resources come from catchments both farther in the west and farther in the east and to the north. So the ARC makes no sense at all from a water resources perspective. But the issues which we face all over England apply very much in the ARC. So increasing pressure on demand because of population increase, in particular in the southeast of the country, increasingly variable climatic conditions, including increasing temperature, which means the southeast is becoming more arid. We're not sure what's going to happen with precipitation. But certainly the southeast is becoming more arid, which is making water resources more scarce. And so given those pressures, yes, water is an issue, and that is very well recognized. And we recognize that tackling that requires action on the demand side and strategic intervention with respect to new or transfer of supplies. And in the analysis we did for the ARC, we demonstrated that the situation is manageable, that if you are strongly active on the demand side, you can also provide some increments of additional supply without exceeding the limits of the aquatic environment, and indeed whilst restoring some unsustainable abstractions at the moment. So we've got to keep an eye on water, but it can be done if we plan and take action on demand in a timely way. Now, over to you, Bev, briefly on this big question which has been going on in the chat about the geography of the ARC.
Thanks, Jim. I think it's a really good challenge, but I don't start at the same. I don't start at the same spot. I don't see the ARC as a place. If you want to use planning speak, it's definitely polycentric in nature, and I don't see it as a city-based region in the traditional sense that a lot of people think of regions now. But I would also argue I'm not sure any of our current political geography makes any sense either. I've worked most of my life in this country in Berkshire and Oxfordshire, and half of one used to be in the other. So I think these are constructs that are meant to try and create some sort of efficiency. If they don't, then I think they fall away. So I think the question that the ARC still has to answer is, can it produce something in collaboration that is more effective and more efficient than it would have otherwise done as independent places? And there are people within the ARC, Buckinghamshire Council don't want to be part of the ARC as such. So there are different ways of looking at that and how people feel that's going to be of value or not to them. I guess the only other thing I'd add to that, Jim, and I think it's really for me, it's quite interesting. I think it goes back to the work you guys are doing. I don't think people should see scenario testing as being some sort of just a tool to be able to validate or confirm what spatial strategies you might employ. Actually, it creates choices. It creates evidence-based choices. And for me, what's really on offer here, and I'm using the ARC as an example, but I don't think it's unique to the ARC. I just hope it's going to be something the ARC does through its spatial framework. By elevating these scenarios and the kind of consequences that happen around these scenarios, then you have very distinct policy choices to make. And I think I don't know if the governance model can stand that. I don't know how it's going to address that. That's something we're going to have to see together. But we have to start making decisions about what kind of sets of places these are going to be. And the example I'll use is when the NIC was talking about, I think when a lot of people, somebody put it in the chat, I think people saw the Arc as the sort of supportive hinterland of London. I think that's what people still see. I remember when I first engaged with EEH, the main things on the agenda were how fast can we get a train into London, and can we get joint ticketing with TfL to make sure we can get people in and out of London faster. I don't believe that's a relevant or the same relevant question as it used to be, not just because of COVID. I think we were on a different path potentially anyways. So I think what this does is it starts to raise challenges about where we've been in the past, where we might go in the future. And last thing I'll say is, I don't think roads anymore are a proxy for where growth should go. I think that it is the last thing we should look at for where growth should go. I think what we're really looking at through models like this is, can we make communities more resilient through growth? Can we use growth deliver in a more sustainable way, which reduces the requirement to travel so much? And can we increase infrastructure in non-traditional ways other than roads? The example I use is, we think something like 50% of NHS visits are being shifted digitally now. I don't think that's going to be just a COVID strategy. I think that'll go on beyond that. That changes the whole pattern of movements around a city like Oxford, for example. Thank goodness, because we need to reduce the number of people who have to go to the JR every day. These are choices we can start to make, as opposed to just circumstances we have to react to. And I think that's the power that the modeling that we're doing here gives us. Thanks, Jim.
That's great. Thanks very much indeed, Bev. I can see there's been a lively exchange going on in the chat, but I don't see anything which I would specifically interpret as an unanswered question. So I'll take that as a cue to draw things to a close. Thanks very much indeed, everyone, for joining us. Thanks in particular to our speakers, Alistair Ford from Newcastle University, Simon Blaney from Southampton University, who's already had to leave us to attend his students, Bev Hindle from the Arc Leaders Group, and Alan Penn from MHCLG and UCL. I hope we've got across a number of things, that this is an ongoing process. We're on a journey here, really inventing a set of capabilities to inform decision making in this very complex place. And so I think it should become one of the things which is informative, maybe unique at some level, but also transferable, of this process of using spatial data and analytics and modeling at the same time as a place is being created. So this becomes part of the Arc endeavor, as well as coming from the Arc, from the universities within the Arc, from the Rutherford Appleton Laboratory in Harwell, where Daphne is based, but also with all of our ITRC partner institutions around the country, including Newcastle and Southampton, who contributed so much to this webinar. So thank you again for joining us. I'm just going to show, if I can very quickly share my screen, just put up the reminder of the next webinar, which will be which will be on next week on the 12th of October. And now we're going from a place which is very local, at least to some of us, to the application of the ITRC's work in international context, working with the United Nations, the World Bank, and a series of governments around the world, which is really underlining the importance of infrastructure for sustainable development. So please join us next week and for the rest of the series, which you can sign up for as you have done for this webinar. Thanks again for joining us. Hoping to see you again soon. Bye-bye.